Welcome to the David M. Kennedy Center. My name is Wade Jacoby. I run the Center for the Study of Europe. We're delighted at CSE to be able to, from time to time, sponsor lectures that are brought to us, as it were, by various members of the BYU faculty. In this case, Professor David Paulson sponsored the visit of today's speaker. He will be worked very, very hard over in the humanities buildings on campus over the next couple of days, but we wanted to steal him for one public lecture here in a building where it's more often the case that we hear from social scientists or international lawyers or businessmen. I'm going to ask Nate Kramer, who's an assistant professor in humanities, classics, and comparative literature, to introduce our speaker, and then the speaker will go for 30, 35 minutes. We should still have time for Q&A, for 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, and we certainly invite your questions. So, Nate, do you want to come up and do the introduction?
Before I introduce Dr. Soderquist, just wanted to thank Wade Jacoby and the Center for the Study of Europe for the invitation, and that Dr. Soderquist is here with us today. Dr. Soderquist comes to us from the University of Copenhagen and the Kierkegaard Research Center in Copenhagen, and he is currently an assistant professor there of systematic theology. His research interests include Kierkegaard studies in 19th century German and Danish idealism, as well as an interest in notions of self and irony in the work of Kierkegaard. Also forthcoming from C.A. Reitzel, a publisher, is his book, The Isolated Self, Truth and Untruth in Kierkegaard's The Concept of Irony, which will be published shortly. And in addition to publishing extensively on Kierkegaard, Dr. Soderquist, did I put that Swedish in there? I asked him how to pronounce that name, whether it was Swedish or a more Americanized Soderquist. Dr. Soderquist has been a significant translator of Kierkegaard research. He currently heads a team of translators at the Kierkegaard Research Center in Copenhagen. Their project is to translate the journals and papers of Kierkegaard into English, and these will be forthcoming from Princeton University Press over the next several years. I also wanted to make mention here that Dr. Soderquist will also be lecturing on Thursday at 11 a.m. to the Philosophy Club, but that is also open to the public. And he'll be lecturing on Kierkegaard's Socrates, Negativity, Nothingness, and Nihilism. And today, Dr. Soderquist will be lecturing on Openness and Closure in Fear and Trembling. So please welcome Dr. Soderquist.
Well, thank you very much, Nate. And I'd like to start with a couple of thanks myself. I'd like to thank Dave Paulson at the Philosophy Department and Nate Kramer, as well as Wade Jacoby for their welcome. And I'd also just like to say I'm really happy to be here. I grew up in Logan, and I've been on campus 2 or 3 times to watch the Aggies lose, and that was about it. So I'm really happy to be here. I really am. So. Let me just introduce my topic today for just a few minutes informally, because I think I'm just going to take my written text and just place it down here and try to do this a little bit more informally, just talk a little bit about Kierkegaard, and specifically Kierkegaard and Fear and Trembling. So what I'd like to do is maybe just say something about Fear and Trembling for those of you who might not be familiar with the ins and outs of this book, a little bit about where it is in Kierkegaard's authorship, and then take a look at a theme that I think is central for Søren Kierkegaard's authorship as a whole, the theme of finding a self, what it means to be a self. And I'd like to maybe introduce that theme and then try to apply that theme to what we find in Fear and Trembling. And then finally, I hope we have a little bit of time just for some questions, because this is really more interesting anyway, to get into a kind of dialogue about some questions around Søren Kierkegaard's thought. And I can imagine that maybe this audience has some slightly different questions than what we usually ask of Søren Kierkegaard. So I'd just like to start then with a little bit of an introduction to Fear and Trembling. First of all, those of you who have read this book, Fear and Trembling, knows it. It's a strange book. It's also a very controversial book. It's the one book that Søren Kierkegaard knew was going to make him world famous, and it's because it's really an extreme version of faith. In this book, Fear and Trembling, Søren Kierkegaard writes under a pseudonym. The pseudonym is Johannes di Silentio, as Johannes of Silence, a pseudonym who can't speak, as he feels restricted. There are certain things he just can't articulate. Now, when he says that he can't articulate them, that doesn't mean that he can't tell a story. He can't talk about certain religious issues, but to really explain them, to really make them rational, that's impossible. Yeah, so Di Silentio, Johannes Di Silentio, a pseudonym, publishes this book, Fear and Trembling, which, as many of you probably know, is a really radical reinterpretation of the Abraham story from the Bible. It's about Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son, and what Di Silentio is interested in as much as anything else is to look, not think about the story as we know it. We know, of course, we hear it in, as Di Silentio says, if you go to Sunday school and you listen to this story, you get the beginning, as Abraham is instructed that, Abraham is promised that he'll be the father of nations. Yeah, a few minutes later, we're told that God says, I'd like you to, execute your son. I'd like you to slit his throat. And then right after that, we go to the end of the story, which says, there was a ram there. So Abraham and Isaac arrived at the Mount of Moriah, and, an angel restrains Abraham's hand. Abraham ends up sacrificing a ram instead, and the story ends. Di Silentio says, see, that's the problem. It goes too quickly that way, because then we just get a nice story, and we can remain sort of unmoved, think about it and say, yeah, that's nice that everything works out well, right? That's really nice. As if faith is a nice, comfortable thing. This is exactly where Di Silentio, as a Kierkegaard's pseudonym, wants to put a question mark. He wants to challenge this simple story of Abraham, and so he dives right into the middle of it. Says, look, maybe we would be better off if we thought about what a horrific position it would be. It would be as how frightening, how much one would fear and tremble in the middle of these 3 days. As a God comes along and says, I'd like you to sort of slit your son's throat, and that's it. That's all God says. And Abraham stands there and says, I'm not quite sure I understood that. Yeah, I'd like you to just sacrifice your son. He says, okay, no reason? No reason. Absolutely no reason. I just want you to do this. And that's Di Silentio's starting point. Let's talk about the horror to be asked to do something that doesn't make any sense and asked by a divine authority, where the temptation would not be to do what God wants you to do. The temptation would be to do what is right. That is what is ethically right. You don't slit your son's throat. That's ethically wrong. So the temptation for Abraham in this story, according to Di Silentio's interpretation, is simply to do the right thing. Right? I'll love my son. I want to love my son. I love my son anyway. I certainly don't want to slit his throat for no reason. And this is exactly what he's been asked to do. So what he sets up is a kind of tension between the good and God, a tension between what is right and what God is asking Abraham to do. And as much as anything, Di Silentio wants to sort of focus on the possibility that those two things aren't the same. That is, that God and the good aren't the same, or that the divine or God can be more than the ethical. That doing what is right is not the only thing that God is all about. That there might be a kind of religious life that goes beyond just doing what is right. And this, I think, is the tension that he's interested in. Now, that being said, the famous line that you've probably heard of before is the teleological suspension of the ethical. As Kierkegaard, in the middle of this book, asks a question, or I should say Di Silentio, the pseudonymous author, asks a question. Is it possible to think about a teleological suspension of the ethical? Does it make sense for us to think that in certain situations that it might be justified to suspend what is right for another goal or another telos or another end? And, Di Silentio thinks that the Abraham story, if we're going to take it seriously, suggests that it is possible, that there's such a thing as a suspension of what is good, as for the sake of some other goal or purpose or end. Now, as I'm certain you all know, there are a lot of different ways that this book has been interpreted, and a lot of different ways that this question has been interpreted and asked. And one of the most common things is to maybe immediately take the perspective of someone thinking ethically. That is, it would be very easy to say, wait. Isn't it true then, Di Silentio, that what you're suggesting is that our ethical values or our ethical principles can really be subordinated to whatever an individual might think he or she hears from a divine voice? Doesn't this open up a lot of sort of problems when we can just get rid of ethics, get rid of that which we are accustomed to discussing and debating and talking about, understanding, and saying, well, as long as God told you to do something, go ahead and do it, right? That would be the implication, at least from an ethical point of view, that Kierkegaard or Di Silentio is suggesting, that as a matter of fact, well, if you hear God's voice very clearly, go ahead and do that. It's okay, even if it goes against everything that you otherwise, even as an individual, take to be ethically good. Now, I think that is a kind of implication. That's a question that one can ask of Kierkegaard or Di Silentio when one's reading this book. But I'd like to suggest that I think Di Silentio's aim is different. I think what he'd like to accomplish here is not so much to challenge the way that we think about ethics, but rather the way we think about faith. Or maybe I should sort of nuance this a little bit. The way that Danes in 19th century Denmark were accustomed to thinking about faith. And here I think there are at least two targets that he's after. First of all, Søren Kierkegaard, he studied theology at the University of Copenhagen, like I did. And, he knows, Kierkegaard is well acquainted with the way that theologians, especially in the 19th century, were inclined to think about saving Christianity, saving religion. And, the easiest way is to sort of reinterpret Christianity, reinterpret faith as a sort of historical movement, as we can make it rational, as we as theologians can start to sort of get rid of some of the more, sort of mythological elements of faith. We can get rid of those stories that don't really make sense, and we won't really say it out loud. But we'll reinterpret faith in such a way that we can talk about it so that it's reasonable and rational. It's just a part of history. What is the significance of Christianity? Well, Jesus came along and presented a new sort of way of thinking about morality. That is, thou shalt love thy neighbor, for example. And that's the beauty of the Christian message, is that we get a new ethic out of this. It's not eye for eye and tooth for tooth. It's rather the message of love. So, for theologians in Kierkegaard's time, at least one sort of tradition was to reduce, and at least as Kierkegaard saw it, reduce religious life to ethical life. That is, what is Christianity? It's about living a good life. What's the significance of Jesus, the life of Jesus? Well, he's the moral lawgiver. He tells us how to love one's neighbor. And thus, we'd interpret this broadly as a sort of just a movement in Western history that shapes the way that Western culture thinks about law, public policy, thinks about ethics and morality. That we have on the one hand. Now, Di Silentio, Kierkegaard's pseudonym here, is suggesting that, maybe they're not synonymous. Maybe religious life is something more than just living a good life. Maybe it's more than just ethical law. Now, there's another polemical target, I think, at the same time in this book, Fear and Trembling, and that is what we might call something like cultural religion. That is, as Kierkegaard sees it, and Kierkegaard was quite impatient about these sorts of things, but there's a tendency, or was a tendency in 19th century Denmark, to assume that, if I'm born Danish, if I'm a good Danish citizen, I'm also a Christian. As in fact, how do I know that I'm a Christian? Well, I do the things that they do. I do the things that we do in this culture. I fit in. I follow what they do. I fit in with my culture. Christianity becomes, I think as Kierkegaard sees it, it can easily become something like cultural values that just get a sort of divine stamp of approval. So the cultural traditions that we as a community say in Denmark, and I think you could think about this even, say, in our religious community. If Kierkegaard were to ask about, say, Mormonism, he might say, well, to the degree that it takes a stamp and says, look, our culture is divine, then I think Kierkegaard would have a problem with that our cultural values become synonymous with what it means to be a good person. So, another criticism that Kierkegaard has of 19th century Christianity is really this notion that cultural values are synonymous with religious life or faith. And that's another reason why he wants to call into question this idea that being a good citizen, being a good member of my community, is synonymous with being a good religious person. And he does that with this story, this strange story of Abraham, by jumping right into the middle of it, looking at Abraham, saying, well, here we got a guy who's been asked by God to do something that's wrong, right? Something that's ethically wrong, something that even Abraham knows is ethically wrong. You don't just slit your son's throat for no reason. And, well, that's where we're at with Fear and Trembling. Now, I'd like to, maybe we can pick some of these themes up again in questions, and if you have any, maybe at the end, if you have any questions about them. But I'd like to shift now to a more general theme in Kierkegaard's authorship. And this is a theme that, as some of you have probably heard of a way of sort of interpreting Kierkegaard's authorship through a theory of stages. A few of you have probably heard of this, where the strategy is to look at Kierkegaard's authorship, start with this kind of idea that Kierkegaard describes different ways of being in the world, different worldviews or different stages, different lenses through which one could evaluate, understand, interpret the world. The lowest being the aesthetic, where one interprets the world in terms of, sensuous categories. These can be very reflective sensuous categories, but it's about something that's enjoyable or not enjoyable, right? Something I find attractive or unattractive. And even sort of traditional ethical categories can be sort of subsumed here. If you're thinking ethically, I find that a beautiful way of behaving. That's why I do it. And I find this very unattractive. That's why I don't act in that way. So even ethical principles can be subsumed into the aesthetic. Now, the next stage that you've probably heard of is the ethical stage, where Kierkegaard describes a way of looking at the world that is governed by a sort of notion of duty or a notion of doing the right thing. And then finally, this ethical stage gives way to the highest stage, a kind of religious stage, where it's no longer just a matter of thinking about one's duty, but it becomes a matter of thinking about, cultivating a kind of inner spirituality. Now, there's something absolutely true about interpreting Kierkegaard's authorship through those categories. People have been doing it for a long time. I'd like to suggest here, though, that there might be a sort of model for interpreting some of the things in Kierkegaard's authorship, some of the themes in Kierkegaard's authorship, that is even, that's a little bit more flexible. You don't have to sort of shape or sort of force Kierkegaard's different books into these categories in the same way that you do with the stage theory. And I'd like, as one way of describing this model, it would be something like, the dialectic of losing oneself in order to gain oneself. He describes it in several different ways, but I think I'll use that sort of theme here. The idea that in order to really find oneself, one has to lose oneself. And what he means by that is I think he takes it as a given that somebody who's thoughtful, somebody who thinks a little bit about who they are and what it means to be a human being will ultimately, experience a sort of loss of faith in the goodness of the universe, will it depends on your pathway here, as Kierkegaard describes a lot of them. If you're an intellectual, it's easy enough to sort of figure out that a lot of the traditions and customs that one sort of experiences in the world are relative, and there's a kind of loss of faith that just naturally accompanies the ability to think. And, he doesn't really see that as a problem, just as a fact. In that sense, he's a very modern thinker. In fact, Kierkegaard doesn't really even try to defend, the religious life against that kind of attack. Look, fine, go ahead and think. That's just what we do. And doubt is a natural part of being a modern person. But he thinks there are other ways of sort of not feeling at home in the world, or sort of losing oneself as something else that's absolutely universal. It's just human pain. As everybody, the most extreme version is everybody's going to experience something like death. Death of a loved one, or as just a terrible disappointment in one's own goals. There's just a kind of obvious pain to being a human being too. That can also lead, for Kierkegaard, the way he describes it, that also leads to a sort of disillusionment, a kind of loss of oneself. And, regardless of the path, for Kierkegaard, we might describe it as sort of, maybe once again, sort of three different spheres. The first one, then, is what he describes as a kind of immediate sphere, immediate understood as unmediated by reflection or thought. That is just a comfortable, everyday way of being in the world, a sort of childlike consciousness where everything has its place. But of course, for Kierkegaard, it's not just children who think this way. We all think this way. We're encultured. We think in terms of what's familiar to us. We can't think in any way different than that. We have to start somewhere, and we start from within our own culture. And that sort of immediate, comfort in the world, feeling at home with oneself in the world, is naturally then going to give way. It's just something that happens. It's going to give way to this sort of, then the second sphere, this sort of sphere of isolation, or disillusionment, or pain, or he calls it resignation in Fear and Trembling. That is, I just don't see, as a given that I'm too smart, right? I'm too intellectual. I don't see how I can really sort of believe in these things that I was told to believe in as a kid. I can't do it. I'm too smart, right? Or I'm too critical. Or I don't see that how life is supposed to. Life isn't working out the way I thought it was going to be, or even the way that my culture tells me it's going to work out, because it gets thwarted. It's painful as people die. The sort of simple stories that I hear about as a youth and that I see repeated culturally just aren't good enough for explaining my very own private experience. At any rate, then the second, we can call it sort of as a moment or element of isolation. That's the move that has to be made for Søren Kierkegaard. The movement towards isolation, feeling alone, feeling confused, and feeling absolutely alone. That's, for Kierkegaard, it's absolutely necessary if one's going to become oneself. That loss of oneself, that loss of feeling at home, is the second movement. And then finally, the goal, and this is where Kierkegaard spends most of his time in his authorship, trying to describe how to get back into that world again. The goal for him is, of course, to feel at home in the world, feel like I'm myself. That's how he often describes it. Feel that I am who I am. I'm who I'm supposed to be. I'm who I was created to be. He calls it sort of as et vasa nærværende. There's probably two people who can understand that. To be close to oneself, or to be present to oneself. That's the goal. To be close to oneself, intimate with oneself. Et vasa nærværende. Now, to get to that point again, to feel like I know who I am, and that I'm fully integrated into my community again, that my relationships make sense to me again, that I know how to love, that I know how to be a human being right here and right now. That's something that Kierkegaard doesn't think is easy to solve. And that's why he offers in various pseudonymous works all kinds of different paths for getting back. In either or part 1 and part 2, as his very first major work, we see really a a long sketch of the disillusioned, isolated individual, and we see sort of the alter ego of this isolated individual trying to convince himself of how to get back into the world again. Kierkegaard actually uses two different authors to describe this sort of tension. The first one is, well, we can call him Johannes. The second is Wilhelm. But this first work is really a sort of debate between these two positions, as a feeling isolated, alone, cynical, skeptical, and then Wilhelm's position, which is often described as the ethical position in Kierkegaard's authorship. That is, this idea that, look, I can choose myself back into the world. And this is where sort of contemporary existentialism comes from, as much as anything, this text. That is, look, I might not know what's valuable in some absolute sense. I might be confused about God's truth, about what's important, about what's valuable, but I'm here alone. I'm alive right now. And I've got the power to choose the things that are valuable for me and what things aren't. And the moment I do that and really commit to this world, through Wilhelm, one of Kierkegaard's pseudonyms, one is in a sense reconciled with the world. One does move from this period, this moment of isolation, back into the world, just because I as an individual, chose what is valuable for me and what isn't. I choose to make marriage something valuable for myself, for example. That's one of Wilhelm's central categories, right? I can choose to be committed to another human being. And as soon as I do that, I find that there's something meaningful out there. And this is one strategy that we see in either or. But that's not good enough for Søren Kierkegaard. He offers 5 or 6 different sort of versions of this reconciliation, which then brings me to Fear and Trembling, as the next, the book that Kierkegaard wrote a couple of years after either or. Actually still a youthful work. Here, then, the question about the reconciliation with actuality is taken up through the story of Abraham. The question is, how is it that Abraham, who's said to be the father of faith, is able to move from a position of confusion, isolation, maybe simply ignorance about what the good life is? How can he move from that position of resignation? I've resigned myself to not being happy in this world. How can I move from there back to sort of human life again? How can I get involved again? And how do I find myself? Yeah. Now, Di Silentio, when he looks at Abraham, says, Di Silentio, the pseudonymous author, says, I'm not a man of faith. I'm too smart, right? I'm too intellectual. I can't believe. I really can't believe, or maybe I don't want to believe. But I really understand this much, that the theologians over at the Department of Theology over at the University of Copenhagen, they don't understand it. And I also know that sort of at church on Sundays, they don't understand it either. So Di Silentio says, look, I don't have faith, but I know they don't either. Because, look, if we really look at Abraham, faith is not something comfortable. Faith is something that involves a horrific fear and trembling. And that's what we have to focus on. And yet, the amazing thing is that Abraham he manages to overcome, or at least, overcome that sort of isolation, overcome that loss of faith, and actually boldly lives in this world. In fact, he says, as Di Silentio says, the thing I love about Abraham, I love thinking about Abraham, the thing that impresses me more than anything, the thing that makes me sleepless, is that I can look out at Abraham and I see that he had faith not for some sort of afterlife. It wasn't this idea that, I'm going to suffer through this life and sort of live a good, ethically upright life, even though it would be a lot funner to be bad, right? In order to get some reward. He says, no. Faith is for this life. It's right now. Faith means nothing if it's only about some reward in the afterlife. Faith means that Abraham was reconciled with the world right here and right now. He became himself. He says, that's what I don't understand. Because, as a human being, even as a smart human being like myself, he says, it's easy enough to negotiate like the Greeks. Di Silentio also loves Greek thinkers. He says, the Greeks, they don't need sort of the sphere of the religious. All they need is just the human, the purely human. Let's just look at how the Greeks solved a lot of problems. They observed what a human being is. They were smart enough to see that one can become disillusioned about truth. One recognizes that life is full of pain, but without incorporating any sort of third categories, anything like God or revelation or anything. The Greeks could just say, look, those are the conditions of being a human being. We're rational animals. Here's a way of surviving, right? Here's a way of thinking about, here's a way of revaluing human life. And without appealing to anything religious, here's how to live. And he loves that idea. Look, there's something beautiful about this idea that the Greeks have, that they just understand what it means to be a human being, what it means to be confused, and what it means to fight for some meaning, to fight to be a whole human being. And he says, the Greeks were honest enough to say that, it's you have to fight a little bit. You have to discipline yourself. Take Aristotle. As ethics for Aristotle is really a matter of developing some virtues so that in the end you as a human being will become happy. It's just developing some good habits. That leads to happiness. That's what it's all about. And that's all ethics is, just some good habits, right? So that you don't fall into some kind of extreme and end up losing yourself at the same time. So, De Silentio says, look, I'm sort of in that tradition in a way, I myself. I can understand what it means to think like a Greek. And this means that I think I would describe my own way of viewing the world as a kind of resigned self. That is, I'm resigned to not being completely happy. I'm resigned to fighting a little bit for, my comfort in the world, fighting to find myself. But I know that it's not going to have any sort of amazing, sort of miraculous ending. He says, that's just the way I am, right? I can enjoy the idea of a God in heaven. I like that. I like the idea that God is love. But I don't really expect God to be sort of interested in me, and I don't care. That's just not my way, he says. I'm resigned. I just don't expect happiness in this world. He says, that's exactly where, he says this first of all, as any religion, anybody who sort of uses the ability to think, the ability to reason as a philosophy in order to sort of negotiate what it means to be a human being, to use one's capacity of reason to really figure things out, to live sort of reasonably, well, they're more or less living like the Greeks suggested. Even if they call their position, or a religious position, it's just plain old human thinking. He says the amazing thing with Abraham is we get an example of somebody who didn't rely on his own ability to understand things. He couldn't, because God said, guess what? I want you to slit your son's throat. That's ethically wrong. I want you to do it anyway. He says, look, I just want to do the right thing, and, well, that's the temptation, right? De Silentio says the amazing thing about Abraham is he did it. He just walked right up to that mount. He said, I don't know how this is going to work out. I have no idea how it's going to work out, because it makes no sense. The very same God that promised me that I will be the father of nations told me that I need to execute my son, and he didn't give me any good reasons for doing either one. And guess what? Those two things in and of themselves are contradictory. I can't be the father of nations and slit my son's throat at the same time. It's a paradox. That's where De Silentio says, see, that's where we're getting closer to faith. It's not about figuring things out. It's about trust, right? In the end, it's about saying, look, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I walk along, I open myself up to something I don't understand. I don't rely on how I can understand religious life. I just trust. I trust that God. And that's what De Silentio says he himself cannot do. He says, I'm not humble enough to do so. I'm really not. He says, I know what it would require. It would require that I sort of release, as I open my hands and give up the demand I myself have of understanding how things work out. And instead of doing that, sort of really saying, look, when it comes to sort of religious life, when it comes to trusting God, I really don't know anything about it. The only thing I know is that I trust. And this is where, this is how De Silentio defines Abraham's faith. It's certainly not blind faith, because blind faith, at least in that sense that one might think about it initially, is something like this. Well, I'll just sort of revert. I'll quit asking questions. I'll sort of turn away from the doubt that's gnawing at me, and I'll sort of return to something that's comfortable and try to sort of wall off that kind of doubt or that question. And I'll just sort of blindly try to believe what I know I don't, I might not believe if I really investigated it. He says, no, that's not the key. The key, go ahead and let those doubts come streaming in. To wall it off is to wall it in. To wall doubt off is really to wall doubt in. You'll never escape it by walling it off or running away from it. So, De Silentio says, look, in the end, the key is really sort of allowing those doubts to reside, to recognize that they're there. And yet at the very same time that one gives up one's demand to understand what it means to be a religious person, or demand to understand the world, demand to understand sort of God's grand plan with an individual, the moment you sort of give that up, he says you get it all back again. And De Silentio, he doesn't promise that's true. This is something Kierkegaard is very careful about. He doesn't tell his reader how he or she is going to experience religious life. He doesn't think that's... he's a person. He's an individual. He doesn't think he can promise something in God's name, but he can say, look, I've read the New Testament. It seems to me this is what God is suggesting, that when you open yourself up, or when I even read the Abraham story, what I see is that God says that God will take care of these problems, that faith comes as a sort of gift. You open up your hands and it comes back to you. The ability to be at home in this world or find yourself is then a sort of a gift, right? That comes at the very same moment that you give up your demand for understanding it. And that's sort of dialectic. It's not like you give up your demand to understand the world on, I said, 2.5 years ago I gave it up and now I get it back. It's not temporal in that sense. It's something that's happening always at the same time, because doubt, that temptation to try to understand the universe, try to understand God's ways, that's always there. And yet at the very same moment, the idea is that if you're residing in faith, if you have these sort of lenses of faith, you'll receive that back again. The world will become sort of enchanted again, exactly through that openness. And, that's why he sort of introduces this story of Abraham, I think. I think that's really what he's got up his sleeve. Look, I can show that Abraham is not blind faith, and yet I can show that at the same time, the key to sort of really becoming reconciled with oneself, to be close to oneself, is to give up a few demands that are natural for a human being, to try to understand God, understand the world. So I think that's where I'll end my informal comments, and we still have a few minutes for some questions and so forth. So, yeah. Yeah. What's that? Yeah. Openness and closure. Yeah. This is actually a word, as Kierkegaard describes this movement, this double movement, that of giving oneself up in order to gain oneself, as a sort of also a tension between closing oneself off to the divine and becoming self-sufficient, as opposed to remaining open and dependent on the divine. This word, as a innesluted, as a closed in or closure, is used in almost a counterintuitive way, because what he says is, in this movement from feeling, from immediacy, an everyday way of being in the world, to this sort of isolated position, is also a move towards individuality, a move towards self-sufficiency. That is, there's something that I as an individual can think about and understand in this sort of moment of isolation that I would have never been able to understand if I had remained or tried to cultivate, tried to hide in immediacy, or hide in an everyday sort of comfortable way of thinking and getting along in the world. He says, at that moment, to be alone, to recognize that I'm really entirely responsible for myself, I'm entirely responsible for my own self-consciousness, to even be aware of one's self-consciousness is kind of a strange thing. I mean, it's really kind of strange how rarely one thinks about what a strange thing it is to be embodied and have hands and be alive. And he says that sort of insight that takes place there can also, it also represents a kind of temptation. It's necessary, he thinks, to really becoming a self, to recognize that I'm free, I am myself. But the problem is one can also, like the Greek or like De Silentio himself, sort of decide, okay, I'm going to take things into my own hands now. I'm going to solve my own life here. I'm going to decide what's valuable for me and what's not valuable. I'm going to create a sort of self-sufficient wall around myself. Kierkegaard calls this innesluttet, which is often translated as withdrawn or reserved. It's this idea that I'm going to sort of take care of things myself. And as another way of translating is just I'm closed, right? And specifically, I'm closed to sort of really sort of opening myself up to loving other human beings, but also I've certainly closed off the pathway to sort of some God who might have some other opinions about who I am. And as I think this is the tension that Kierkegaard loves to investigate. I mean, he investigates this in almost all his works, as this idea that I can choose on the one hand to sort of be responsible for myself and define what I take to be valuable, or I can do something that's far more risky. That is, say, I'll open myself up to something divine, and maybe I won't find what I want to find, because maybe God has some different opinions about who I am, what I fundamentally am. I mean, Kierkegaard sees, I think, ideally, this sort of openness as a kind of dialogue between something divine and your own choices, right? As sort of a constant dialogue. Am I doing this to be myself in a good way, or am I doing this because this is how I would like to define myself, sort of self-sufficiently? This is who I want to be, and therefore I'm choosing these sort of different paths. So closure and openness is it's another way of describing the same movement that he sees in Abraham, or the movement that's at play in this work, Fear and Trembling, between isolation and closure, and then openness and faith. Yeah, here. Yeah.
You mentioned at the very beginning the radicality of Kierkegaard's reading of the Binding of Isaacs, which I certainly have no reason to contest, but I wonder if you've looked at how it relates to traditional readings, Jewish and Christian, to Luther's, to Thomas's. Are there precedents? Are there similarly radical readings or readings that would be compatible with Kierkegaard?
Yeah. I can't say that I've gone through sort of the list of sort of major figures who have done this, but I mean, one thing that Kierkegaard was aware of is that this is anachronistic. His way of interpreting Abraham is anachronistic because there's already an ethical rule that says thou shalt not kill, that he sort of moves back into the story. And he wants to look at this story as a question about as a Christian faith. And that's already anachronistic. That means that the traditional ways of interpreting this story, for example, as something that at the University of Copenhagen, in the theology department, one might hear, is that this is, of course, it's a kind of myth about the end of human sacrifice, right? We find this for the first time. We find this story early on in the Bible as a sort of, myth that teaches God's people that it's no longer necessary to offer human sacrifices. Animal sacrifices are fine. I mean, there were sort of historical, critical ways of interpreting the story there. Kant is another person who interprets the story and says that Abraham just did something wrong. It's ethically wrong. And Kierkegaard agrees in some sense that, look, if you're going to think ethically, or De Silentio agrees, if we're going to remain within ethical categories, it is wrong. Of course it's wrong. You don't kill your son. But I don't know. Sure.
The very phrase, the teleological suspension of the ethical, is kind of a curious phrase.
Yeah.
That presupposes that the ethical is not teleological. theological, but I suppose deontological or constant.
That's right. It's yeah. Yeah.
And yet he's obviously aware of Aristotelian and other ways
Yeah.
of perceiving.
Kierkegaard this is an interesting question, because I think De Silentio wants to push the idea of ethical as far as he can. He wants to make it as comprehensive as possible. I think he wants to include Hegel there too. And Hegel wasn't only sort of duty based. He was also in dialogue with good laws. As there was something objective about ethical requirements too. But that's another issue. Maybe we should,
I don't know how closely related Danish and German are.
Yeah, they're quite close. Yeah.
They are. Okay.
Yeah.
So, from my limited understanding of German, I've been told that German has no exact word that conveys the concept of faith. All it has is Glaube, belief. And does Danish suffer from that same thing?
Yeah, it's the same thing as a Glaube is tro, right? Which can both be belief and faith. And Kierkegaard can use that, right? Because Kierkegaard doesn't want it to be belief in the intellectual sense. He wants it to be tro, as a faith, as a kind of, he wants to sort of remove it away from something that one understands.
So he doesn't have a word to make that distinction?
He doesn't have a word to make that distinction. Kierkegaard, he loves ambiguity. And that's exactly the kind of ambiguity he loves to play on, right? There's tro and there's tro, but I mean it in the second sense, not the first, right? This is his way. He's not a very good analytical philosopher, because he uses the same term in 5 different ways. But he likes to do that. Nonetheless, of course, it's obvious that as you read the text, he's not confused, right? But he doesn't have access to say, he can't say belief and faith using 2 different words. Yeah.
Something that you've caught yourself doing several times here is eliding Kierkegaard
Yeah.
and Silentio.
Yeah.
What difference does it make in
Yeah.
your reading of it to set a rigid distinction between?
It's a great question. The reason I think it's important to set the question or make a distinction there is because De Silentio says he doesn't understand faith and puts it on the horizon, right? There must be somebody like Abraham. Or he says, look, every other person in the room, or every other reader might be a knight of faith, somebody who really has faith. But you can't see it on the outside. It's something that's totally internal. But because he's not within that world, he's describing something that, maybe his description, even compared with Kierkegaard's description other places in his authorship, is too extreme. That is, I think that it's clear that even in Kierkegaard's religious authorship, that he's not quite as demanding as what De Silentio is. De Silentio sees this confidence in Abraham, this total reliance, and this ability to negotiate doubt as something that just happens, right? It's mysterious for him. It keeps him up at night because he's amazed by it. But the question is, does Søren Kierkegaard have a more nuanced vision once we get into the religious life or the life of faith? And I think there, it depends on how you read Kierkegaard, but I think it's possible to see that Kierkegaard's own authorship, his own description of faith, are a little bit more nuanced than De Silentio's. As he still puts it out there as pretty demanding. It's pretty extreme, I think. Kierkegaard's very impatient when it comes to sort of doubting or sort of relying on other people or being a part of a community. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Here and yeah.
You speak of Kierkegaard as loving ambiguity.
Yeah.
And as a Danish reader, I find his writings incredibly hard to understand.
Yeah.
I like to pride myself on that I know Danish and I can understand Danish, but reading his work, he gives a very distinct feel in his writing. Where would you place his writings in comparison with other 19th century Danish authors, but other authors in general?
Yeah. It's because I like Kierkegaard, I'm going to say this, but I think he's one of a kind. I really think he's one of a kind. I said, nobody writes like he does, even in his time. It's weird stuff, and it's ambiguous, and he's playing with language all the time. And I think part of the fun of reading Kierkegaard is even getting used to the tone I mean, he's not, as you've probably heard, the melancholy Dane. I mean, that's not true most of the time. He's the witty, ironic Dane. He's always got a smile on his face. And not always. A lot of times. He's, whistles while he's writing and things like this. He's very ambiguous, but I think it's... I think he was one of the few people in his own time who was writing like that. I can't really think of... I mean, even somebody like Schlegel, a German author who was maybe a generation earlier than him, who was sort of known for introducing irony to literature, he's not nearly as ambiguous as Kierkegaard and doesn't play with things like Kierkegaard does. But, I mean, as soon as I say that Kierkegaard is one of a kind, I'm sure there are other examples, especially in literature outside Danish literature, but there's none of his contemporaries are like him. He's better than his contemporaries. Or at least he's different, right? He's different. Yeah.
You talked about when Kierkegaard is kind of comparing, or Disilentio rather, is kind of talking about this Greek way of thinking and humanistics and stuff like that. At the time of Kierkegaard, especially with the kind of religious thinking that people were around, is he making any reference or comparison to atheists, agnostics, or people like much of Scandinavia that are just totally indifferent about this kind of thing? Or is he talking about kind of people within the religious world, like theologians who think and reason a lot about religion, but maybe don't really have faith?
Right. I think as a... excuse me. I think actually everything you said fits. In other words, of course he's aiming it at theologians who are trying to make faith reasonable, make it historically palatable. But when it comes to sort of you asked the question about sort of atheism, or at least agnosticism, which is sort of the way Scandinavia is today. I mean, for Kierkegaard, that attitude was identical back then. The only difference was people went to church, were uninterested in the divine, even though they were going to church. To be a good citizen in 1830 meant you went to church and got baptized and you got buried in the church, and you sort of did your duty, right? It was your duty to go to church, and you should sort of at least publicly say the right things about religion and so forth. But it was exactly that absence of personal conviction, the absence of even that idea that it should be personal conviction that is foundational for one's faith that he's aiming at. So in a sense, it's the same thing. I mean, this sort of apathetic attitude towards religion is what he saw the state church in 1830. So I think it's actually the same, or it's related. I mean, I think Denmark's probably a little less, or a little more apathetic now than it was in 1830 as a whole. But let's see. Did you have a question? I saw your hand up earlier, but I don't know if.
Yeah, I just wondered. You mentioned several times Kierkegaard talked about being a part of, like you said, Europe or whatever, being a part of something as a human being.
Right.
You also mentioned how existentially stripping down of all these things,
Yeah.
so you come to know your true self. And it reminded me a lot of Nausea by Soderquist.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, does he see any value in being part of humanity?
Yeah.
Does he see more value in not being part of it, or does he see both?
Yeah. It's dialectical, like everything in Kierkegaard. The end goal, the goal for Søren Kierkegaard, is to be actively, to really find oneself. And to find oneself, you can only do that by recognizing that I'm surrounded by relationships, other people, right? My employer, my wife, or my state, whatever. I am defined by my relationships. Thus, the end point is finding a way to get back and find oneself in the midst of that world. That being said, he thinks that that's not possible unless you feel this moment of anxiety, which is what nausea is about. Sartre picks up on the same theme of anxiety, something Kierkegaard introduced in his book, Concept of Anxiety, and just plays it out in a 20th century way. But Kierkegaard sees both those moments as necessary. They're dialectical. You must be alone in order to eventually be yourself in a community. You can't skip right from being immediately in a community to being sort of critically in a community. You have to continually go through this recognition of being alone or isolated, responsible, etc. Is that it? Yeah.
I just
Okay.
want to say, as I listened today, I'm really struck by, we've just announced the formation of a European Studies major at BYU, which those of us who worked on it conceived as a kind of, how do we cross this hard humanities, social science boundary that we often have here on campus and incorporate a reasonable amount of curriculum in a major that draws on the strengths in both areas. And I can hardly think of a better advertisement for that than the talk here today. So I'm really grateful to David and the philosophy department for bringing Brian out, and we're particularly grateful for Brian for delivering such an engaging lecture. So thanks very much.
Thank you.